So you're all very welcome to this Bioeconomy Ireland Week event, the plastic problem, an Irish perspective for a global challenge. And we're delighted to be joined by a panel of that cover the spectrum of plastics, knowledge and expertise. So it's great to have them here. And it'll be really their responsibility to keep you entertained and informed during the course of the day, so no pressure on them. So we'll have a short introduction from each panelist for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get into some questions and discussion. Our first panelist today is Dr. Liam Morrison. So Liam is a professor in the Department of Natural Sciences in NUIG. So Liam, maybe if you could give us a brief introduction to yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. My name is, as Tim said, Liam Morrison. I'm in Earth and Ocean Sciences in NUI Galway. My background is in marine biology and in chemical oceanography. And for most of my research, I've been looking at contaminants in the marine environment, contaminants that impact on shellfish, on seaweed, and eventually impact on humans. So I've looked at organic and inorganic contaminants, things like pesticides, things like metals. And I suppose nowadays we're moving into what we refer to as contaminants of emerging concern. And what fall among them are microplastics. Because I suppose really over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of increased research on microplastics. And when everybody thinks of microplastics, they think of the oceans, and they think of the oceans as the ultimate sink for microplastics. But you must remember that all plastics originate on land and ultimately end up in the sea. Now, if you were living 100 years ago, your everyday products would be made from natural materials like wood and rubber and cotton. Your clothing would be made from cotton, etc. But you only have to look around you today. Not alone do we live in extraordinary times because of the pandemic, but everything around us is made plastic. And there are huge societal benefits from plastic. But ultimately, the plastics, unfortunately, end up in our environment. Microbes haven't really evolved yet that can degrade or break down plastics. And I suppose nothing has been brought home to us more in the plastic pandemic, if you like, the impact of COVID-19 and the use of PPE in saving lives and how necessary that has been. But most PPE, unfortunately, is made from plastic as well. So much of my research, much of the panel here are looking for solutions in terms of bioplastics and alternatives and alternative mechanisms of recycling and degradation, etc. I'm looking at the problem. I'm looking at plastics in organisms, in sediments, looking at the impacts of different types of polymers. And also and I'll finish off by saying is that we even have in the plastics, we even have the plastosphere. They have their own sphere because they have that layer of life or biofilms or organisms that grow on the surface of them. And they're also very good at absorbing contaminants out of the seawater, out of fresh water, things like metals and pesticides, and also pathogens, viruses, bacteria, antimicrobial resistance. So it's multifaceted, the impact that they have on our environment.
That's great, Liam. Thanks very much for that. And next on our panel is Dr. Catherine Collins. So Catherine is a research fellow in Shannon Applied Biotechnology Centre at the Technological University of the Shannon Midlands Midwest. So Catherine.
Thanks, Tim. So my name is Catherine, as Tim just said, and I work in TUS, as it's now known, and formerly Limerick Institute of Technology. So I'm a research scientist, and my area is in biotechnology, and biotechnology is basically using living organisms to produce everyday commodities. So for example, yeast give us beer, you have fungi, they produce enzymes which can go into our detergents or washing our clothes. They also produce various medicines like antibiotics. So, and my area of speciality is working on fungi and mushrooms. So you're probably wondering, well, what have fungi and mushrooms got to do with plastics? Well, currently I'm working on a European-funded project called the Bio-Innovation Circular Economy for Plastics, BioICEPS, and this is a European-funded project, and it brings together scientists from all over Europe. There's 12 different groups and 3 different groups from China, and the idea is you have material scientists, biologists, and different companies who have an interest in plastic recycling or making new plastics. And we're all coming together to tackle the burden of waste plastic in our society. And my role as a scientist on the project is to look at fungi and can they help in the breakdown of plastics. So why do we think fungi might be useful at this job? Well, first of all, they are known to produce a lot of enzymes, and these enzymes can help in the breakdown of plastics. Then also they produce hydrophobins, which allow them to attach to the plastic. And they also have hyphae, and the hyphae are the furry structures you see if they're growing maybe on rotting fruit or whatever, and this helps them penetrate the 3D structure of the plastic itself. So, for example, because plastic buildup in our society is a relatively new problem, the microorganisms are only being recently studied for their ability to break down plastic. And for example, aspergillus, which is a black mold you sometimes see growing in damp areas like a bathroom, this has been shown to be able to break down some plastics like polyethylene and polyurethane. So this research is really in its infancy. So that's what we're trying to do in BioIceps. We're looking at different fungi isolated from different environments, perhaps from waste plastic on the beach or waste plastic in a farm. So we're looking at isolating the microorganisms from there, and we're seeing can they grow on plastics as their sole carbon source and break it down. So that's basically covers our interest in plastic here in TUS. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And just hand over now to Neil Skeffington, who's CEO of an Irish SME called Novelplast.
Good morning, guys. Thanks, Tim. As Tim was saying, I'm the CEO and founder of a company that's based in the County Meath, Gaeltacht, called Novelplast. We have been in operation for just over 2 years now. It's been a bumpy few years with all the wobbles that life throws at us these days. Novelplast focuses on finding solutions, recycling solutions for post-industrial plastics mostly. Typically, we try to recycle the materials that other people don't recycle. So we look for big lumps of plastic. We recycle fibers, off-spec flake. We don't do the sexy stuff like the bottle recycling. We leave that to the people who have plenty of money for it. My background is I'm a polymer engineer by trade from Athlone IT, or formerly Athlone IT, now TUS. I've 18 years experience in manufacturing mainly PET. The first 13 years was dedicated to making PET, and I'm hoping to dedicate the next 13 years to finding solutions to recycle it. We have a couple of new projects on at the moment. One of them is a consortium that received DTIF funding along with Athlone IT and UCC to chemically recycle PET. So we're looking at chemically recycling food trays, so to be colored trays, and a lot of the science goes over my head, but it's typically using enzymes to recycle them and to separate out the pigments and stuff, and we end up with the monomer, which is the building block then to remake virgin PET with a recycled content in it, which is kind of the holy grail for PET recycling. We also have a new project on at the moment. It's a joint venture with a company down in Cork called Ocean Ore, where we are going to set up a plant hopefully next year to recycle fishing gear and gear from aquaculture. So we have lots on at the moment. It's an exciting sphere to be involved in. And yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know.
That's great. Thanks very much, Neil. So next is Dr. Finno Farrell, who's a researcher in the Centre for Radiation and Environmental Science in TU Dublin. So Fionn.
Thanks very much, Tim. So good morning, everybody. So as Tim said, I'm a researcher affiliated with the RESC in TU Dublin and with the School of Chemistry and Pharmaceutical Sciences. So my research focuses on valorization of shellfish waste streams, taking what's left over from the shellfish production, from the industrial production, and trying to add value to the materials that are in there. One of the most interesting materials is chitin, and chitin is a fantastic alternative source for carbohydrate-based, biopolymers. I'm a large proponent of using the marine resource as a tool by which to address an awful lot of the environmental and sustainability issues we face today. Ireland is in a very privileged position in that we have responsibility over a sea area 10 times larger than our actual land area. I'm very interested in addressing the plastic problem in finding alternative sources from the multitude of possible biosources. Shellfish and chitin are just one part of a larger puzzle. Of course, we have to look at things like seaweed, our macroalgae, pulps, wood pulps, husks, and of course, recycled plastics, the synthetics that already exist, to try to give them as long of a commercial life as possible. I'm always very keen to address this problem in a cross-disciplinary and cross-industrial manner. This is a problem that will face us for a long time, and we need to take opportunities to bring us all together like this, where we can talk about breakdown, treatment, alternative sources, and then the longevity of these materials. So I'm very excited to get to be here this morning and get to share this panel with my colleagues. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Fionn. And then our final panelist is Emily Marsh. So Emily is a bioeconomy project manager in the Circular Bioeconomy Research Group in Shannon ABC in MTU Kerry. So Emily, I'll hand over to you for a minute or two.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you for having me on today. Yes, my background is in environmental sustainability, so I kind of come from Liam's side on the problems around plastic, but now I've moved into the area of research on circular bioeconomy. So I like to think that's looking at the solutions for it. So about closing that loop and having the most resource efficiency available. So from the bioplastic side, I'm currently working on a BBIJU, a bio-based joint undertaking European project, BioSwitch, which is supporting brand owners to make that switch from fossil-based to bio-based. But then, of course, within that, then consumers are considerable, in developing that value chain. So I'm looking at it from kind of the downstream consumer side, and that consumer acceptance of bio-based products and packaging is very important to kind of bring that along into the solution. So we've carried out a study along with our project partners in the Netherlands and Finland. And we've had some quite positive results coming back from that. So 93% of the respondents, the consumers, are accepting of bio-based products. So they would like to purchase those in the future. So understanding these consumer behaviors and purchasing variations are important to bring that bioplastics into the solution. So thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Emily. So this is our panel for today. So quite covering the kind of breadth of the area of plastics, as you've probably heard there. So I suppose just to start off, Liam, I suppose you would have been want to be kind of living under a rock over the last while, not to realize that plastics is a problem. And you had kind of alluded to it when you started off there, but maybe you could give a bit more context for the breadth of the problem that's there at the moment in terms of plastics contaminating the environment.
Yeah, no, it is. It's certainly one of the it's one of the greatest challenges I think we're going to face for the 21st century in terms of our aquatic and our terrestrial environment. And if you think about it, right, I'll give you some statistics. Less than 25% of plastic is recycled today globally, okay? And of all the plastic that's ever been made, and you must remember that about 400 million tons of plastic are produced every year. And as a testament to their use, their versatility, and their societal benefits, that's increasing every year. But of all the plastics that have ever been made, only about 9% have been recycled. 12% have been burnt, and the other 79% have ended up in our soils, in our oceans, in our landfills. And like another staggering statistic is that half of all the plastic that has ever been produced on the planet has been produced since the year 2000. Now, if we take it home on a national scale, we are the highest producer of plastic waste per person in the European Union. Out of the other 27 member states, we actually produce more plastic waste per person than in any other European state. We're also the fourth worst when it comes to recycling. And that's data released by Eurostat within the EU. Now, some scientists estimate that there'll be more plastic in the oceans in the year 2050 than there will be fish. I don't know about that, but definitely it's a problem in all our in the different components of our environment, from our soils, even our atmosphere. Now we see that we are microfibers and particles in the atmosphere that we're breathing in. And it has been shown already from research in the last 12 months that we as humans accumulate the equivalent of a credit card per week, actually, in plastic. Now, the other side of it is you look and you think, okay, what are the harms associated with this? And we see, for example, in marine organisms, there's a whole range of problems. So you have, you know, the classic images you see of seabirds being entangled in nets, or you see turtles ingesting, and we have a project going in our lab at the moment looking at the micro and macro plastic debris content of the gut of turtles. I think we have about 15 different turtles of 3 different species that have been stranded in Ireland. And a lot of the time you see the plastics in the water column, they mimic or they look like their natural prey. So a plastic bag can look like a jellyfish, and a turtle will go for it and ingest it. And often they cause, you know, problems in the stomach that result in reduced feeding. In shellfish, where they go for particles or fibers in the water, they impact on the breathing and on the functioning of the gills. They cause impaired reproduction, reduced fertility. And also, as I alluded to earlier, plastics take up contaminants out of the water. So when a fish ingests a piece of plastic, and if there is mercury or cadmium associated with that, our tummies, like fish tummies, are acidic, and the mercury will be released from the plastic and into the tissues of the fish. And then it can move up through the food chain into higher organisms, and eventually into us when we consume tuna or we consume mackerel or whatever. So you can have this biomagnification and transfer of these pollutants. So there's a whole range of problems, and it's not just with metals, it's also with phthalates, which are a component that are used in plastics. So a lot of the chemicals that are used in the production of plastics, like, for example, antimony is one example. It's a metal on the periodic table. It's used as a stabilizer and an additive in the production of plastics. If you look at the UK, for example, at bottled water, one of the criteria on which bottled water fails its environmental quality every year is on the antimony levels, because the antimony leaches out out of the plastic and into the water. We had this issue years ago with babies' bottles that were made from plastic with bisphenol A or BPA. Now, we don't know a lot about antimony because it hasn't been a traditional priority in pollutant, but we know it has a very similar chemistry to arsenic and is very likely to behave in a similar way, which is a class 1 carcinogen. So the problem is widespread, because we know that these microplastics are found from our mountaintops, depths of our oceans, and they are ubiquitous and they are everywhere. And really, I'll finish off by saying that in little over 100 years, you know, plastics have gone from being hailed as this scientific wonder because of their benefit to society to now being reviled as a huge environmental plague or blight today. And yet there's so many societal benefits. We just have to look at how to address the waste problem.
Thanks very much for that, Liam. I think you set the scene extremely well there, and certainly for some of the statistics there, quite shocking, really, in fairness. But I suppose you've given a nice kind of segue into the next question, really, which is around, you know, it's addressing the plastic waste that's there at the moment, but also identifying other ways to produce different types of materials that can replace plastics. And so in terms of those kind of 2 different tracks, in terms of, you know, the remediation of plastics, I suppose there's 2 main ways of doing that, I think, at the moment, which is chemical and biological. And Neil, I might hand over to you first, if you don't mind, just in terms of, you know, the impact of chemical remediation, for want of a better description, of plastics, and some of the work that you do in your company. And I suppose, how difficult was that to get going in terms of the technologies behind it? You know, how well established are they? And if what you're doing is successful, how easily or not can that be scaled up for other companies to do similar things, or for your company to expand further, I suppose?
Yeah, so Sorry, somebody just came into my office there. Yeah, so I had 3 young neighbours came around to the factory there a couple of months ago, and it's kind of a follow on from what Liam was discussing earlier. And I was bringing them in to show them recycling. I promised them for months I was going to take them in, and they're 10, 8, and 6 years of age. And the first thing I did when I got them in was, I said, what do you think when you hear the word plastic? And one of them said, plastics are bad. And I said, why? And they said, because plastics kill animals. And that's the narrative that's out there about plastics. And really, it's not the plastics that's killing the animals, because the plastics are not throwing themselves in the ocean. Plastics are not dumping themselves at the side of the street. It's the humans that are bad, whereas the plastics provide so many solutions. We fool ourselves in Ireland thinking that, you hear these stats coming out from the likes of Repack saying, oh, we recycle 70-something% of our plastics, and we don't. We bail them up, and up until the last year or two, we've been sending it off to China, to Malaysia, and because we don't have the infrastructure to deal with plastics in Ireland. We're so far behind the curve, and what that means is that these countries don't have the infrastructure to deal with these plastics either. So they're taking what they can from it, and the rest of it is ending up in landfill, or they're burning it, or it's making its way into our ocean. So we taught at these other nations for putting our plastics into the ocean, when really we should be finding ways to deal with it ourselves. So really what the solution, as we see it, we do mechanical recycling here, which is what we do. We shred the materials, we blend them, we extrude them, we filter it out any dirt that might be in it. But it has its limitations, because there are only a certain number of times you can mechanically recycle a plastic before it starts losing its molecular weight, it starts losing its strength, its mechanical properties. And really there has to be a chemical recycling solution that goes along with the mechanical recycling. Chemical recycling is great in theory, in that you can break down the polymer back into its original constituents, and you can use those constituents then to remake a virgin polymer with the same properties as the original virgin polymer. So it's kind of the holy grail of recycling, if you can do it. Many companies are trying to get it right at the moment. Nobody has fully commercialized it yet, because it's an expensive process. A lot of them take a lot of energy, a lot of heat to try and break down the polymers. And really, if we can manage to pull this off with the guys in TUS and UCC, it will be a real win for recycling here in Ireland and abroad. We would hopefully end up with a licensable technology. So for me, there has to be a chemical element to the recycling infrastructure. That's if we're going to really solve the problem. We're so far behind the curve. We, as Liam was saying, we produce plastic like it was going out of fashion for the first 50, 60 years, without actually thinking, what are we going to do with this plastic? How are we going to fix what's going into landfills? How are we going to recycle it? How are we going to deal with the problem? And really, we're only getting to grips with the actual problem as it is at the moment. Same with microplastics in the ocean, and we need to find ways to deal with it sooner rather than later. So that's my take on it.
No, that's great. Thanks very much, Neil. And I suppose then the not exactly the opposite side of the house of that, Catherine, but the biological side of remediation. And you mentioned just when you did your introduction there that it's fairly early days in terms of that. But maybe you could have a discuss around that just in the context of the BioICEP project, that you're not just looking at fungi producing enzymes, it's a kind of multifactorial approach that kind of Neil had referred to there as well, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. So we have some of our partners are pre-treating the plastic first by mechanical means or by ultrasonication or UV treatment. And the idea there is to make access sites more available for the microorganisms when they come along to the plastic. So I focus on fungi, but we have other partners who are focusing on bacteria. We're looking at algae here, and it is very early days, but the idea is that we're isolating them from environments where they have been exposed to plastic for a number of years. So we'll isolate the organisms from there, and we're hoping that they have a better chance then of being able to grow in the plastics because they've adapted to that environment. And then because they will grow them as well on plastics that have been pre-treated either by the mechanical means or that should help in the breakdown. And yeah, so that's what we're currently doing. And then also in nature, microorganisms don't work on their own. They're usually in a group and in a community, in a consortia. So what we're going to create also is to take different microorganisms that can grow on different plastics and to see if they can come together and tackle the problem of mixed waste plastic. So that's one idea. And also we're going to see if the breakdown products from the plastics created by the microorganisms, if they can be used to create biopolymers so that you get a circular economy for plastics.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Catherine. Just in the context of those two aspects of it, the chemical and the bioremediation, you both mentioned kind of it's reasonably early days yet for both of those. Are there kind of any, not exactly quick wins, but often when you start doing work in an area, you can advance quite rapidly. It's the finishing of it that can be quite difficult and take more time. Are there things that are kind of advanced that can be made quite quickly there in terms of addressing those issues? Neil, I don't know if you want to start off there maybe.
Yeah, I can jump in there. You know, the likes of DuPont, who are kind of the pioneers of a lot of plastics, PET especially, they have been chemically recycling PET waste from their factory for years and years and years. Just they use a simple enough glycolysis method to do it. But chemically recycling clear plastics that's clean is easy. Anyone can do it with a reactor, bit of temperature, bit of ethylene glycol, and you can chemically recycle PET. But it's, you know, mechanical recycling can handle that type of material. It's the difficult to handle material. Every time you pick up a food tray in the supermarket, there's layers of plastic on it that probably don't need to be there, but the supermarkets want it or the food producers want it because it might give them an extra 2 days of shelf life. Every time you peel open one of these trays, there's layers of polyethylene there on top of the PET that makes it very, very difficult to recycle. Your colored trays that the marketing people like to see because it stands out on a shelf, they're the problem plastics that need to be dealt with. So are there quick wins? I wouldn't say there are quick wins, but there are definitely developing solutions out there. It's whether you can take it to a commercial level to make money out of it. The problem over the last few years has been virgin plastic has been so cheap that people they weren't interested in recycled solutions. So that needs to change. It will help if there was legislation from government to break that link between virgin plastics and recycled plastics, because recycled plastics are expensive. The process itself is expensive, and if it's linked to a virgin price, which is linked to the oil price, and the oil price drops, then people aren't that interested in recycling anymore. So that's not a good solution for us to have, I think.
And certainly regulation is an interesting one there. I mean, in terms of, you know, say the government providing tax incentives for companies like yourselves to establish and try and address those kinds of issues, do you think that kind of an advancement would help?
It would certainly help if there was something, because it's like we are a small island, and sometimes when you're putting a recycling plant in, you need scale to be able to make money from it. So, you know, like there are supports there from Enterprise Ireland where, you know, if you're setting up, they could invest 250,000 or whatever it might be, but typically that's a drop in the ocean for what's actually required to build a plant at scale that can do it. So certainly if there was other supports there in terms of equity or in terms of low cost loans to help you get over the line, because raising money for a startup alone is incredibly difficult, just because the banks don't have an appetite for risk, and you really need to sell yourself and sell the technology to be able to get money for it. So for sure, if there was some kind of funding there from government or from EU to assist with startup costs, then it would be huge, because there's a lot of smart people out there. You know, there's Athlone IT have been at the forefront of polymer development for years, and there's a lot of ideas down there that will need money to get off the ground. The DTIF funding is great. they were the first IT to get DTIF funding for this perpetual project we're working on last year. But there's lots of other smart ideas down there that need money and they need backing. They need the likes of Repack to start putting money into development, R&D for recycling, as opposed to just giving subsidies to the waste companies for bailing it up and shipping it out of the country.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Neil. Catherine, just to finish off on that one there, regarding the chemical and the biological, are there kind of rapid accelerations that can be made because it's at an earlier stage?
Well, I suppose one thing we have to remember is that polyethylene and polypropylene, they account for over 50% of the market share of plastics right now, but they're also the toughest plastics for microorganisms to break down. So I suppose we have to think about shifting away more from those type of plastics if we want microorganisms to help in their degradation. And then I suppose including additives into the plastic could help with the biodegradation process as well, such as starch. There are things to remember. And then I guess, you know, we've seen how quickly scientists have come together to solve COVID and produce a vaccine. So, and as this is a big global issue as well, you will see the science community in terms of microbiology coming together more, I think. And we've seen recently like a gene for a gene to degrade plastic PET, that enzyme has been taken from a bacteria and put into a microalgae, and the microalgae can grow just using sunlight. So, you know, I think we will have to be imaginative moving forward and to think about the microorganisms and their point of view of how they're going to grow on the plastic.
That's great. Thanks so much for that, Catherine. And Emily, might go over to you on that one as well, if that's okay, in terms of, you know, easy wins and maybe the more kind of social side of it and consumer behavior and things like that.
Yeah, so from a consumer acceptance analysis side of bio-based products, most likely for consumers to buy which particular categories was around packaging, but that was still only about 50% of consumers and 52 from Netherlands, about 50 from Ireland, but it was considerably higher for bio-based packaging for food items. So I think that is the particularly sort of easy win then, and that from the consumer side, because there is that market drivers and acceptance there. But also I think from sort of the end of life side as well, you know, there's a lot of confusion around the different types of bio-based packaging. So, you know, there's the biodegradable and the non-biodegradable, which from the technology side is well understood, but from the consumer side, it's not as easily understood by the consumer and general population. So it's important to have that labeling on the products. So it's kind of, you have, because the consumers are the solution there that will drive the uptake of bio-based plastics, and once you get more on the market, that will, you know, reduce the cost then downstream. So, you know, there's that solution there that will go along the chain. But regarding then the, you know, the non-biodegradable, kind of the question mark around the sustainability of those. So I think around the compostable and biodegradable bioplastics. They are kind of the solution there, especially for food items. You know, there's a lot of kind of contaminated fossil-based plastics that go to recycling, and with the contaminated food, you know, it's not accepted there. So to have that kind of combination that you can have either industrial or home composted food packaging is kind of a win-win-win in that section there.
Thanks, Emily. You mentioned the bio-based packaging there and bio-based plastics, which kind of brings us on to the second arm really of a potential solution. You know, in addition to kind of dealing with the plastics there at the moment, it's providing an option or an opportunity for plastic type material from biological sources. And Fionn, maybe you might make a few comments just around, I suppose, how realistic is the opportunity around biological alternatives to plastic materials, I suppose?
Indeed. Well, from a purely technical point of view, can it be made and can it be done? The answer is yes. It is tremendously feasible. I have here in my hand this little translucent plastic, and this is made completely from chitosan. Chitosan is the deacetylated version of chitin, the more soluble version. And I've made a couple of these. These were made in my lab by me, who is not a specialist in large-scale manufacturing and supply chain of these materials. I'm an analytical chemist, and I'm interested predominantly in molecules and materials. So to say whether or not this is feasible, reasonable, or realistic, the answer is absolutely, this is realistic. To make these sorts of materials can be done, and it can be done in a relatively cost-effective way. To sing to Emily's point there, really the key is to start to be able to gain some sort of market share with these materials. In order for us to be able to scale these technologies, in order for us to be able to process them at a industrial scale, commercial scale, and start to make money out of it, we have to be able to obviously gain market share. And the easiest way to do that is to go for the lowest hanging fruit. So realistically, with bio-based plastics, we don't want to start with the very technical plastics. We don't want to start with the high application plastics. As Liam mentioned, things like PPE and medical plastics, plastics that are used in healthcare settings, are crucial and have probably the highest societal impact in terms of the plastics we use in our everyday life. But we're not going to start replacing them with bio-based alternatives at the beginning. Really, we need to look at the much easier to access, much more common and sort of lower impact societal impact. Things like, of course, food packaging, but even more simple than that, planters for people who want an easy way to move and transfer, shrubs or small plants from your garden center. Compostable packaging. How often are you cutting up your onions or your apples or your carrots when you're making your dinner? And I often use one of those blue mushroom trays from Tesco to hold it all in, and then I tip it into my compost bin afterwards. Wouldn't it be great if we could make a low-cost bio-based alternative for that blue tray, which you drop straight into your compost heap? So like those are the spaces where we need to focus, because those are the spaces that are most realistic. And they don't need to be pretty, they don't need to be sexy, they don't even necessarily have to have the most rigid form. They just have to be able to accomplish that low-hanging fruit task that they've already been assigned. So I believe that it is really genuinely very realistic. And of course, bio-based plastics has to come up to the mark we want it to come up to as we reduce our reliance on the more synthetic and the fossil fuel-based plastics. And I mean, as Neil has outlined there, chemical treatment of these, treating the synthetic plastics and also creating the bio-based plastics should realistically be complementary to one another. And ideally, we would end up living in a world, as Neil said, it's a small country here. We would need to be able to scale these things, and the bio-based production and the synthetic remediation should be able to support one another. In terms of us gaining funding and gaining subsidies, being able to have a bio-based aspect of your production should also be complemented by having a synthetic remediation and vice versa. So I think it's tremendously realistic.
And so I suppose I don't want to move away from that question, but connected to it is about uptake and enterprise acceptance and consumer acceptance. But within all that is, I suppose, performance of these bio-based materials and cost of production as well. And so certainly a very valid point in terms of going for the low-hanging fruit in terms of performance, because it's maybe not as much of an issue. But I suppose in terms of cost of production, how much of an impact, or what are the levels of difference of cost? And I realize that's a very broad question, but I don't know if you've got any comment to make around that.
Certainly. I mean, so as part of my research, we undertook some scalability and commercial feasibility with our partners. We have partners in Norway, in Nofima, who are on the production side. And then we had a supply partner, Irish Fish Canners, based in Killybegs. And really, we took a very fundamental economic approach to this: supply, demand, and price. Ideally, in the best case scenario, the cost of your supply is low and the cost of your product is high. And that difference makes up obviously your profit, and you're able to start enacting a higher level of business and make better quality products. Right now, specifically with regard to the Shellfish Bioplastics, the base material that this is made out of is free. The producers who are creating the crab meat that you can go and buy in Tesco and Aldi, they have to get rid of all of the leftover materials once they've removed the meat, the shells, the mineral composition, the leftover brown meat that we don't eat. And right now, that just goes to landfill, is incinerated, or often it can be dumped at sea. And that material doesn't really have a market value.
So the supply there is quite low cost. As Emily said, there is a high appetite, especially in Northern and Western Europe. I have partners in Sweden and Norway who are some of the world leaders in taking a bio approach or environmentally sustainable approach. There's a huge appetite in the marketplace. People want to vote with their dollar and they want to buy things that they believe have a lower impact on the environment. You know, this is a narrative that isn't new. This was a strong narrative when I was a child. This was a strong narrative when many people were young 50 years ago. We now live in the post-narrative time. We know that this has to happen and we know that this is changing. So we have a demand, clearly, and we currently have a supply, specifically for these shellfish-based. But we also have supplies of other waste materials from other waste streams. There is clearly a cost analysis to be undertaken there. And in our cost analysis, we were able to compete with the production of these materials in other marketplaces where costs are often a lot lower, for example, in Asia. So the world leaders in producing chitosan-based plastics are in China, and they have a different cost structure to us. They're also less regulation bound. And these materials here are as cost effective in production. So I believe there really is a strong incentive and a strong economic argument there for these to be produced.
And just following on from that then to Emily, maybe, in terms of, because what ultimately, you know, in terms of some of the applications there that Fionn was talking about, you need a company who's willing to carry a torch to a certain extent and say, right, I'm going to switch over from a plastic that I know works to this material that I don't know if it works or not. I don't know if it'll be any good. You know, in terms of some of the work you may have done around enterprise acceptance and, you know, uptake of these kinds of materials, how do you get over that barrier of getting somebody to change their minds and taking a risk?
Yeah, so from kind of the brand owner, industry, business kind of side to it, some of their kind of risks and barriers to it were around feedstock availability. So as Fionn mentioned there, when you have these waste side streams that can be easy access and valorization of those wastes are extremely important, and to bring that into the bioplastics is certainly kind of the most sustainable approach, as well as, you know, some of the other feedstocks for bioplastics. There's a certain question marks, you know, around land use, water use, energy. So to kind of bring in those waste side streams are certainly kind of from a sustainable and circular economy point of view, the best way forward. And to address kind of some of more of the kind of cost issues as well, as Fionn mentioned, the easy accessibility and the lower cost of those types are certainly ways to bring that in. And the functional performance then, and how easy it is to kind of drop into their current supply, you know, to have those drop-in bioplastics. And also then once kind of the big brands are moving in that direction, that will bring the whole market with it then, and with the consumer acceptance, especially around the low-hanging fruit of the food bioplastics, to kind of develop the market there, and that will encourage and move that whole thing along. So.
Thanks for that, Emily. And I'd just like to go back to a comment that Liam had made towards the start around the plastosphere, and I suppose referring to the organisms that maybe grow predominantly on plastics in a certain environment. Liam, just in the context of some of the things that Catherine was talking about earlier on about bacteria or fungi or microorganisms that will grow on plastics and potentially produce enzymes to break them down, is there a connection between those two things, or is the plastosphere just simply bacteria who like sticking onto the plastics but won't actually kind of degrade any of it?
Well, in the marine environment, you see, a surface it's like real estate. It's where you live. So every organism, every sessile organism attaches in some way to a natural substrate or to an artificial substrate. And also in the marine environment, you must remember that most of the early life stages of organisms are almost microscopic. And plastic is a substrate, and everything from macroalgae to microalgae to cyanobacteria to bacteria to pathogens to viruses attached to it. So we look at it first from our point of view as it's a substrate, it's real estate. I don't know really much about the enzymes or about the mechanisms of the breakdown or how effective it is. I know for us in certain circumstances, when we put out, we deploy virgin plastic pellets around the countryside because we use them as indicators of water quality. So for example, we would deploy in net bags, maybe some polypropylene, some polyethylene, some PVC pellets that we source from a company in the Netherlands. We would deploy them in Galway Harbour, and then we would deploy them out in Connemara in areas well removed from human activity, places we consider pristine waters. And they would give us an indication when we would bring the pellets back and then remove the contaminants on them. We would get an idea of what contaminants are in the water. One of the problems for us is that sometimes the pellets come back and they're heavily fouled or colonized by a variety of different organisms. And it's a substrate, and it's somewhere to live. And I think that's really why organisms are attracted to them.
And so it makes it be somewhere for them to hang their hat, as you say, as opposed to something they'll actually grow on.
Yes, and the other thing also is like with metal contaminants, and I was at a European cost meeting yesterday on microplastics and plastics and plastic debris and nanoplastics, which are even becoming more important now and more challenging. And one of the issues around the whole idea of the whole plastics research is that because it's a relatively new discipline, if you like, we don't have any standardization or harmonization of methodology. So we don't have definitive standard operating procedures, which make it difficult or confound comparing studies between different countries. But one of the things we're beginning to realize now in terms of environmental impact is that it's potentially polymer specific, and that we can't just start grouping these as, oh, this is how microplastics behave. And I'll give you an example. PVC is a relatively abundant microplastic in the marine environment, and it is always associated with high levels of lead, which attach to it. So it has a much greater affinity for lead for some reason than other plastics. Also with the biofouling of these plastics, it tends to increase their density, and as a result they sink, and they sink down through the water column, and they become incorporated into the sediments. So every polymer has a potential different toxicity and has a potential different environmental fate and behavior. And we have to actually start, our next phase is to moving away from the microplastics as a general term and into more polymer specific research.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Liam. I'm going to keep on going with another couple of questions. If anybody does have a question, I do note a comment there in the chat box we'll get to in a minute. If anybody does have a question as well, if they want to raise their hand or put it in the chat box, we'll get to that in a minute. But I might go to Neil there just for a minute, if that's okay. Neil, you'd mentioned earlier on just the difference between some of the plastics that you work with and, as you kind of described it, the kind of sexier plastic bottles. Why don't you work with plastic bottles in terms of recycling? What's the technical challenge associated with that, or the cost? Or
it's not so much the tech, it's quite a mature market, I gave a presentation in February 2019 to a sustainability conference. I was over in Prague, and we were explaining what we do, because not many people do what we do, because it's quite difficult and energy intensive and labor intensive, but after the speech, I was affectionately called the bottom feeder of the plastics industry. But like every ecosystem, you have to have bottom feeders. You have to have people who will clean up the stuff that nobody wants to touch. So we bring in huge big lumps of degraded plastic here that would end up in landfill. We take it for free from a lot of people in the UK, in Europe, in Ireland here. We take these degraded lumps, and typically they would be from startup of your factory. So, you could easily go out and spend 20 million euros, even though we don't have a bottle recycling plant here in Ireland. We have a very small one in Monaghan, and I know Panda are talking about building a bottle recycling plant, but there's plenty of options out there for recycling bottles.
Okay.
Whereas it's the other stuff that's out there that if nobody deals with it, it's going to end up in the landfill. So I wear my bottom feeder hat proudly when I go to these conferences.
I was about to say, because it certainly seems to sound like, as you say, the bottle recycling is kind of, not exactly, it's covered to a certain extent, but the more problem plastics are the ones that people don't want to deal with because they don't have the processes in place for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, like this new project we have with the fishing nets, you go to every fishing port in Ireland, and there are mountains and mountains of nets. And it's not just Ireland that has a problem with it; it's everywhere. You know, Northern Ireland, the ports are just full of mountains of nets. They don't know what to do with them. So we're going to try and come up with a solution in the next 5 to 6 months. We got a grant from the Department of Environment to do that under their Circular Economy Innovation Grant Scheme, which was great to get, because this R&D costs money, and we're moving material around, trying to, doing shredding trials and sorting trials, and trying to come up with a solution for it. So, we need people out there who are going to come up with solutions, and bio has to be part of that solution, because there's just too much packaging out there at the moment. And as Emily kind of was saying as well, there's an issue with language in biodegradable plastics. And what's biodegradable? You could have 3 or 4 asterisks after biodegradable for different materials, because you can't just put it all into your compost bin. It's not the way it works. You have issues in the recycling industry as well with the language and what's recyclable and what's not recyclable. And so again, help from legislators would help in that area to determine what is a bioplastic, what is biodegradable, and what is not.
And when you mentioned the fishing nets and that sector, in terms of, a kind of an opportunity in terms of there's lots of waste there, it's something that I've only kind of come to think about more recently, is that we have all these research scientists working on this area in laboratories around recycling of plastics, and yet in research laboratories, the researchers are one of the biggest users of disposable plastics in the world. So I think saw a stat recently that researchers will use up to 14 or 15 times more plastic than the general consumer. I think that there's one lab in Ireland in NUIG, I think the Curran lab, who actually have a green certification.
Dr. Una Fitzgerald is
absolutely
leading. She's great. She's super.
And I do think it's something, and it's one of those things that people don't really think about that much. But I think it's one of those things where we need to look at ourselves as well as kind of saying we're doing all this research. And
Una now runs a module in NUI Galway at postgraduate level on green labs. In fact, all our own labs have just signed up to in Earth and Ocean Sciences have just signed up to the Green Labs program, and had our meeting. And in fact, I have 2 laboratories, one dedicated to metals and the other dedicated to plastics. And in the plastics lab, everything has to be glassware or metalware, and in the metal lab, everything must be plastic.
What I might do, I'll get to some of the questions and comments if that's okay. So the first one there, and certainly like to welcome Bronwyn, who's dialing in from Australia. So very good to have you on board here, Bronwyn. Thanks very much for joining us. And from the Urban Co-op said, if we can be of any help to trials on the bio-based plastics for our suppliers on a small scale, we'd be delighted to connect. And I don't know if you want to take 30 seconds just to give background to that comment, maybe just for the group here to get context for it, maybe.
Well, greetings from Limerick here. As a social enterprise, we have a community grocery here and wellness hub. So we sell organic fruit and vegetables, and it's all out. People often bring in their well-used brown paper bags to do their shopping. And so the type of customers we have and membership that we have about 2,500 members, and we have footfall of about 600 to 700 a week. So people are very, active consumers, and so they're actively trying to reduce their plastic, etc. So we're trying to work with the smaller suppliers to say, listen, can we get some good packaging for you and help you get your product to the market, to the consumers in an easy way? Now, I mean, I bow down to your superior knowledge on all the scientific background on plastics. I wouldn't dare to want to know as much as you do about it. And I do realize it's really, really quite complicated, but the desire from the consumer is really to make an effort, and we want to make it easier for them to do so. So if we can help in any way, please just get in touch, come down and visit, whatever, please trial us. We're very open.
No, that's great, Anne, and many thanks for putting the comment in there, and I have the website here tagged So thanks very much for that comment. From Bronwyn, sorry. So thank you very much for the wonderful research you're doing. So to the panel here, thanks very much. Here, soft plastics, I presume that's in Australia, have been recycled into road surfaces, but I'm concerned that this could over time leach into the environment. Bio-based plastics are needed, and I'm really hopeful that the fantastic fungi can come to our rescue. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to comment around the leaching from the plastics recycled into the road, if anybody's any knowledge or experience around that.
Yeah, I can just say to you that the two main sources of plastics, the first source is grey water. So it's basically everything that comes out of our washing machine, because all our clothing is made from polyester and is synthetic nowadays, ends up in our wastewater treatment plant. The second one is actual tire wear. And that is every time a tire hits the road when you're driving, a range of particles that are microplastics come off it, and they end up in our stormwater drains and then are transferred into our environment. So road surfaces made from plastics, yeah, I would have concerns as well to additional inputs of plastics from that.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Liam. Noel, you have your hand up there.
Yeah, sorry, apologies. I'm having some technical difficulties, but anyway, yeah, look, I agree with all of your previous commenters there, but I think fundamental to everything we've discussed here this morning is the collection piece and the separation piece. So it has worked quite effectively for the glass and the aluminium cans space. And if we can get into a situation either through education of the consumer, or by legislation for the manufacturers in terms of their product design of their packaging and so on and so forth, but get to a situation where you can collect all of these plastics efficiently. And then you're into a realm where you have economies of scale, and you can use that material quite effectively back into new products, whether it's in a circular way or whether it's downcycling into other products or recycling into other streams. But just on the point there, previous talkers about roads, we've worked with a company called Polycom, and they produce a polymethacrylate, I suppose, bead. They use it to bind roads together right all across Australia, Asia, so on and so forth. And one of the fundamental parts out of that, or products that are problems that throws up, is this wastewater, I suppose, leaching of their components into the river streams right across the different countries. And the ways they're looking at trying to approach that is that they actually recycling the materials that they're using on the roads. They're able to do in situ recycling and compact all of those materials back into the road. So they're seeing a dramatic fall off in the amount of microplastics that's coming out of there. But it's just some insights, I suppose, into some of the challenges there.
No, thanks very much for that. No, much appreciated. I just note the time, and I will one final comment here from Vivian that says to promote the transition to a circular plastics economy, a clear policy framework is needed, and the EU Commission would like to hear your views. And Vivian has very kindly included a link there, so I'll email that out to all the participants in the event today. So look, I say we've just hit past 12 o'clock. So I'd just like to thank all the panelists, Emily, Fionn, Catherine, Liam, and Neil, for such interesting insights today on plastics, and thanks to all the attendees here as well. And Anne, I will certainly try and be in touch with you further down the line as well. So thanks very much for your comments. So thanks very much, everyone. The webinar is over, and thanks very much for your contribution.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you.
Bye-bye.